60 Minutes Rewind.
If the label says made in China, what it doesn't say is made in China by prisoners in forced labor camps. Prisoners whose only crime may have been speaking out against the system, preferring democracy to Chinese communism. And on many garments and many products, that's the case. That's why Congress wants to attach conditions before they agree to renew China's most favored nation trade status, or MFN as it's called. President Bush supports renewing China's preferential status without conditions and informed Congress that he's obtained a firm, high-level commitment that prison labor products won't be sold to the U.S. Are the Chinese keeping their word? Not from what we saw in China just a few weeks ago. In a remote prison camp called Tonggamu in the barren foothills of the Tibetan Plateau, we took these pictures of prisoners marching to work in blue uniforms. Many of these inmates are here for life. In another camp in the capital of Qinghai province, these prisoners are processing sheepskin and making leather goods which, as we discovered, will end up in stores across America and around the world. The videotape was shot by Harry Wu, a former Chinese political prisoner now living in California. He agreed at great personal risk, since he's still a Chinese citizen, to go back with a hidden camera to do what no outsider has ever done before: take pictures inside Chinese forced labor camps.
You spent a total of how much time in prison?
19 years.
19 years.
Harry Wu's crime? As a student, he spoke out against the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Not far from Beijing, Wu managed to get us into the Qinghe prison farm, where he spent 4 of his 19 years as a political prisoner, and where he says he was nearly starved to death. Entrance is strictly forbidden to anyone but labor camp personnel. But on this day, as we drove 15 miles from one end of the camp to the other, no one stopped us. We could never figure out why. Along the way, we could see prisoners at work building a canal with picks and shovels, which is exactly what Harry Wu did when he was in this prison.
If they catch you doing this, what happens to you?
Go back to the camp again.
You could go back to prison.
Of course they will put me back again.
Why are you doing it then?
Because I think the world have to realize there's a camp system in China.
A prison camp system modeled on the now defunct Soviet Gulag, which experts say is made up of several thousand labor camps and millions of prisoners. Most prisoners are forced to sign confessions before they're even tried, and once convicted, few have a realistic chance to appeal their sentences. Human rights groups say brainwashing and torture are rampant. The Lee brothers, both former political prisoners now living in Hong Kong, were released just 2 months ago after former President Jimmy Carter intervened. They'd been jailed right after the Tiananmen Square movement required to do forced labor, and they claim tortured.
It's very painful to recall. Once I sat on a stone bench with a table in front of me. One policeman sat on the other side, questioning me. Another stood behind me. Whenever I refused to admit something, the one behind me would strike me with an electric prod. The shock made me tremble, and I couldn't sit still. I fell on the ground. It was unbearable.
How many political prisoners are there? Recent secret Chinese documents indicate that approximately 1 in 10 are in prison for political reasons, says China scholar Orville Schell, who was our consultant on this story.
We don't really know how many prisoners there are. Let's take 5 million. It's a totally arbitrary number, and we can't be much more definite, but that means that there's 500,000 political prisoners. That's a lot of political prisoners.
All prisoners, including political prisoners, are supposed to reform themselves by doing forced labor, reform through labor as the Chinese call it. And this is one of the prison factories where reform through labor takes place, a plant on a busy street in Shanghai that makes hand tools. From the front, it looks like a normal factory, but behind the facade on a side street, the barbed wire and the guard tower are unmistakable. This man, who is afraid of being identified, is a former high-ranking Chinese police official, now living in Hong Kong, who is familiar with the plant's operation.
So who are the people who work in this plant?
The majority are reformed through labor prisoners, criminals, labor reform criminals.
Prisoners who are there performing what we would call forced labor, working against their will?
Yes.
No doubt about that.
Yes. No doubt whatever.
In Beijing, Teng Zhiguang, who is Vice Minister of Foreign Economic Relations and Trade, the government ministry in charge of China's exports, repeated to us the commitment his government reputedly made to President Bush. No question, but that the policy of the government says that products made through forced labor will not be exported from this country.
No,
Under no conditions.
under no condition.
Posing as a Chinese-American businessman who wanted to import hand tools, Harry Wu met with officials at the Shanghai Liaodong Machinery Factory, the prison factory that makes the tools. Wu asked about purchasing some to sell in the United States and secretly recorded the conversation. Remember, it is illegal for forced labor goods from any country to be sold in the U.S.
We would like to speak quite openly with you because in the U.S., Congress recently made a big deal about the special nature of our kind of enterprises.
What about the special nature of your enterprise?
Our products are never exported directly. We always go through the import-export company system.
As far as I know, the U.S. has a trade law that prevents importation of products made by prison labor.
But we will be exporting indirectly.
But they'll be able to find out. This will give us trouble because the customs will find out.
Not if we don't export directly.
We invited the prison officials to another meeting in a Shanghai hotel room and secretly recorded our conversation. Harry Wu introduced me as the president of the American company interested in importing their hand tools. I told them that the one thing that bothered me was the reliability of their prison workforce. Given that these people are what you call reformed through labor, we would call forced labor, that they are reliable. I mean, that they turn out a good quality product. They told me there'd be no problem, that their factory had been in business for 41 years. You know, I have to be honest with you, Mr. Tong. I have spoken to officials in Shanghai, of the Shanghai Liaodong machine plant, which uses forced labor. They said they don't export directly. They do it through export-import companies.
It's not to my knowledge, in the first place. No prison-related manufacturing facilities has been ever given the right to engage in foreign trade. They're not allowed.
I saw it with my own eyes. It's not in some obscure part of the country, it's in the middle of Shanghai. Prison officials told me that they want our business, they could export to the United States, and there was a way to get around the problem of the United States Congress by doing it through an export-import company.
To me, it's inconceivable.
I heard
They're not supposed to.
but they're doing it.
Then they are violating the government policy, if that is true.
But 3 weeks after we interviewed Vice Minister Teng, the Shanghai prison factory was still sending faxes to Harry Wu trying to sell those prison-made goods. We asked Orville Schell why that's so bad.
The question is, who is making the goods?
Prisoners.
Prisoners. And who are the prisoners? If you have people who are locked up without trials, who are locked up because somebody didn't like what they said, what they thought, what religion they believed in, what they wrote, the kind of films they make, the kinds of poetry they write, this, I think, at least most Americans would find very offensive.
The story will continue after this.
Can you understand that Americans don't want products made by these people under forced labor exported to the United States?
As a matter of policy, the Chinese government never allows the export of what you call forced labor product.
This may be China's official policy, but we had no trouble finding that numerous government-owned Chinese enterprises are violating it with impunity. In the forced labor camp where they process sheepskin and leather, Harry Wu asked the prison manager about importing his forced labor products to the U.S. No problem, the plant boss told him. And then he gave Harry Wu the name and address of the import-export firm in Hong Kong that could handle the transaction. So we went to Hong Kong and met the middlemen, the Winmate Trading Company. Once again, we pretended to be importers. They told us a lot of these prison-made leather goods are finished in Korea and sold in the U.S. So we invited them to a meeting that we secretly videotaped. This time our sound man, Ned Hall, posed as the company president.
The laborers themselves are prisoners? Yes. Have you had experience with this kind of labor in the past? Have you found it to be dependable?
Yeah, they have their own regulation, and also we send our people to keep on checking the quality also.
Yes.
Once we report to them, the quality is not up to standard, the prisoner will have the punishment or beating or some other things.
Did she say what I thought she said? That prisoners will be punished or beaten? She did.
Once we report to them, the quality is not up to standard, the prisoner will have the punishment or beating or some other things.
Do you think that the government of China is capable of enforcing a policy of no forced labor exports?
Absolutely.
Absolutely? Then how was it that the Volvo company received a letter on behalf of China's labor camp enterprises offering to provide, quote, a large number of criminals as very cheap labor to foreign manufacturers? How would you represent this letter to Volvo?
As I say, I do not know. It's not to my knowledge. I've never heard of this.
I'll show you the letter. I'd be happy to show you the letter. We hear that you want to build plants in Asia. We would like you to build a plant in China, and we will be able to provide a reliable, cheap workforce of prisoners.
I don't know. This name is not even known to me.
You think this is a mistake?
Either a mistake or the letter itself is in doubt.
Then perhaps you can explain to me the 1989 law book, the Law Yearbook of China, which is published by Beijing's Law Publishing House, said that in 1988 alone, the value of products for export made by forced labor increased by 21%. Now, these are the figures published by your government, by government publication. It's in print. How would you respond to that?
I never know it.
You never know it. Now, your position is what? You're the Vice Minister
of Mulford.
Of Mulford, which is in charge of export
and import.
And import. And you don't know about it?
No, it has never happened.
That comes from a government publication.
Government publication can make mistakes.
We pointed out to Vice Minister Tung that numerous government publications brag about the use of forced labor for export. One official prison reform journal says the labor reform enterprises throughout the country have great potential for developing exports and earning foreign exchange. Minister, it comes from your own government publications.
As I say, even those publications make mistakes.
You're an expert on the Chinese government. I don't understand why they would lie to us, to foreigners, about something that they boast about in these internal documents.
The Chinese have a long tradition. The information they share among themselves within the country is very different from what they expect to share with people outside, namely you and I. And they're become used to operating on this kind of dual system. So they don't imagine that you will know these things.
Vice Minister Tong says he can't understand why China's most favored nation trade status should depend on issues he says have nothing to do with trade.
Including human rights, arms control, forced labor, as we talked about.
So that China's continuing most favored nation trade status should have nothing to do with human rights in this country?
No, not in my
view. Should have nothing to do with forced labor in this country?
No.
It is only about business.
Business is business.